8 May 1945, the world erupted in celebration. Crowds filled the streets, believing the deadliest war in history was finally over. But while millions cheered, a terrifying secret remained hidden, one that proved the nightmare was far from finished. Because on Victory Day, the war may have ended, but the suffering had not. The morning of May 8, 1945 dawned quietly over London, the air still heavy with the smoke and dust that had lingered for years through the Blitz and relentless bombing campaigns. For 6 long years, Europe had endured a relentless cycle of fear, destruction, and displacement, yet on this day, the world seemed to pause, holding its breath before erupting into celebration. In the streets, people began to gather cautiously at first, still uncertain whether the war had truly ended, their footsteps echoing across cracked pavements scarred by the weight of ration lines and the remnants of air raid shelters. News had traveled overnight of the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany, officially signed after the fall of Berlin on May 2, 1945, yet the official confirmation now made it undeniable. The war in Europe was over. Soldiers trudged wearily through the crowds, their boots worn thin, their uniforms stained with mud, blood, and sweat from the final weeks of relentless combat. Many carried the ghosts of fallen comrades with them, shadows that clung silently to their every movement even as the city around them erupted with cheers and jubilation. The atmosphere in Paris carried a similar mix of relief and disbelief. The boulevards were alive with the echo of horns, laughter, and singing as Parisians spilled into the streets, their arms raised high with flags of red, white, and blue. Cafes emptied their tables to the sidewalks, people grasping strangers' hands and embracing neighbors they had not seen in years, swept up in the emotional tidal wave of liberation. Yet beneath the euphoria, the evidence of suffering and destruction remained undeniable. Buildings pockmarked by bullets and shrapnel bore silent testimony to months of occupation and resistance fighting. The air smelled faintly of smoke and gunpowder, reminders that the joy of victory could not entirely mask the memories of violence that had touched every corner of the city. Returning soldiers moved through the throng with the same expression, a mix of relief, exhaustion, and disbelief. Some smiled weakly, shaking hands and nodding at friends and family, while others' eyes remained distant, haunted by images of the rubble, the terrified civilians, and the relentless pressure of command decisions that had defined their lives for years. Across Berlin, the streets told a different story. The fall of the city on May 2, 1945 had left a scarred landscape of ruined buildings, overturned vehicles, and silent shells of homes where families had once lived. The capitulation had been total, yet the emotional release was complex and uneven. For civilians, there was the tentative sense of survival, a cautious hope that the end of combat might allow them to begin rebuilding some semblance of normal life. For soldiers, both Allied and German, there was the bitter taste of exhaustion mixed with shame, fear, and relief. The streets were littered with abandoned weapons, discarded helmets, and hastily burned documents meant to hide evidence of atrocities committed over the preceding 6 years. The air carried a strange stillness at first, broken intermittently by distant shouts, the rattling of debris, and the occasional crack of a collapsing wall, a final reminder that the city itself had been a battlefield until its very last hours. In Hamburg and Dresden, cities that had endured some of the most devastating Allied bombing campaigns, the human cost was starkly evident. The once pristine architecture was fractured, homes reduced to rubble, and entire neighborhoods obliterated by firestorms that had consumed everything in their path. On this Victory Day, survivors emerged cautiously from basements and makeshift shelters, faces marked by soot, tears, and exhaustion, eyes scanning the streets for signs of life, for neighbors, for family members who might have survived. Children clutched at parents' hands, confused by the sudden joy surrounding them, not fully understanding the scale of the conflict that had dominated their lives. Soldiers moved among them, some offering blankets and rations, others simply walking silently, their minds replaying the horrors of urban combat and the relentless advance toward Berlin that had concluded just days earlier. Each step in these ruined cities was both a victory and a reminder, a paradox of relief mingled with grief and disbelief. The radio carried voices of announcement and celebration, recounting the timeline of final operations, including the encirclement and surrender of Berlin on May 2, the collapse of German command structures, and the unconditional capitulation of German forces across occupied Europe by May 7, a surrender that was confirmed in various regional commands in Denmark and Norway by 8 May 1945. Families huddled around receivers, listening to the formal declarations and official speeches, their faces alternating between smiles and tears, their minds attempting to reconcile years of uncertainty with the tangible reality of peace. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed the nation, his voice steady yet tinged with emotion, acknowledging the sacrifices of soldiers and civilians alike, marking this day as one of triumph yet carefully noting the immense cost borne by so many. Across France, Charles de Gaulle's proclamations echoed through liberated cities, intertwining patriotic relief with sober reflection on occupation, resistance, and the looming challenges of reconstruction. Yet even amid celebration, subtle signs reminded the populace that the end of war did not immediately equate to safety or closure. Soldiers stationed along the peripheries of former front lines still faced logistical chaos. Scattered German units had yet to surrender in some regions, and pockets of combat persisted in isolated areas of Czechoslovakia and Austria. Supply lines were strained, communication networks fragmented, and the sheer scale of displaced persons created a precarious humanitarian situation. Returning soldiers, while eager to rejoin family and communities, often carried orders or responsibilities that prevented them from fully immersing in the festivities. Their eyes told stories of sleepless nights, close calls, and the tension of constant vigilance, a quiet counterpoint to the exuberance around them. The smells, sounds, and textures of the day were intensely layered, a sensory collage of relief and memory. The aroma of street food, baked bread, and faint smoke mingled with the tang of sweat and mud on uniforms. The clatter of marching boots and rolling wheels intermingled with laughter, crying, and the distant wail of church bells. Flashes of sunlight reflected off metallic debris in streets, illuminating shards of glass, twisted metal, and rubble that had survived the final push into Berlin. Each sensory detail anchored the moment in lived experience, reminding both participants and observers of the depth of destruction and the physical reality of survival. As the day progressed, soldiers reunited with family members, children clung to parents, and couples embraced with tears and relief. Yet in the faces of many, there remained a quiet tension, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had been lost. The war's end did not erase 6 years of trauma, and the memories of fallen comrades, destroyed homes, and irrevocable change lingered heavily. In Dresden, Hamburg, Paris, and London alike, the streets vibrated with human emotion, a mixture of celebration and mourning, relief and exhaustion, hope and fear. The fall of Berlin on May 2, 1945 had signaled the military conclusion of Europe's nightmare, but the true work of rebuilding lives, cities, and nations had only just begun. By evening, as daylight waned and shadows lengthened over bombed-out rooftops and cobblestone streets, the initial fervor of celebration settled into a quieter reflection. Fires from impromptu street bonfires flickered against walls, illuminating faces marked by relief and sorrow alike. Soldiers walked among civilians, some laughing quietly, others silent, processing what they had endured. Families sat together, clinging to the fragile miracle of survival, sharing meals and stories amidst the remnants of a world forever altered. The surrender of Germany, though officially declared, had not yet healed the wounds inflicted over years of relentless violence. Yet, for the first time in a lifetime, millions could feel the tentative stirrings of peace, the promise that the long nightmare of war was drawing to an end. It was a day of triumph, of grief, and of reflection, a day when the world celebrated, yet quietly acknowledged that the human cost of 6 years of conflict would linger far longer than any parade or speech could convey. Even as the streets of London, Paris, and other Allied capitals erupted in celebration on May 8, 1945, pockets of Europe remained caught in the uneasy limbo between war and peace. Soldiers on the peripheries of the front lines were still engaged in scattered operations, their movements dictated by orders and communications that had yet to reach isolated units. In southern Bavaria, near Munich, German garrisons lingered in place until formal surrender orders reached them in the days immediately following May 7, the date when Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force accepted Germany's unconditional surrender in Reims. For these men, and the Allied troops assigned to monitor them, the celebrations broadcast over radios and newspapers were a distant echo, disconnected from the mud, rubble, and tension of a front that had not fully dissolved. The terrain itself seemed to resist the notion of peace. Roads were cratered, railway lines destroyed, and bridges partially collapsed, remnants of the final Allied push that had cut through southern Germany after the fall of Berlin on May 2, 1945. Vehicles struggled through debris-strewn streets, while soldiers carried supplies on foot over steep hills and broken asphalt, their boots muddy and heavy with the weight of weeks of forced marches and hurried engagements. In Austria, particularly around Linz and Salzburg, units of the German Wehrmacht had yet to receive official notice of surrender, and isolated resistance persisted until mid-May. Local Allied reconnaissance patrols moved cautiously, observing towns that appeared empty yet could conceal armed soldiers or desperate civilians. Each corner turn brought potential danger, every shattered window a possible sniper's sight line. The smell of smoke still clung to streets where firefights had recently occurred, mixed with the heavier, acrid stench of decayed supplies left behind in hastily abandoned positions. Soldiers learned to remain vigilant even as the wider world believed the fighting was over, their training dictating caution, discipline, and the constant assessment of risk. Radios crackled sporadically with messages from command confirming that while V-Day had been declared, operational reality lagged behind public perception. Meanwhile, in Czechoslovakia, the Prague Uprising had unfolded between the 5th and the 8th of May 1945, a chaotic mix of civilian resistance and retreating German forces. As Allied troops advanced toward the city, they encountered not organized armies but fragmented pockets of resistance, desperate soldiers fighting not for ideology but for survival, and civilians who had taken up arms in a last attempt to liberate their homes. Smoke rose intermittently from street fires, and the sound of sporadic gunfire punctuated otherwise quiet avenues. Civilians moved cautiously between buildings, some tending to the wounded, others gathering meager supplies, their faces etched with exhaustion, fear, and the tentative hope that the surrender of Germany might finally grant them safety. The juxtaposition of jubilation elsewhere and sustained danger here created a surreal atmosphere. Newspapers in Paris reported V-Day parades, while in Prague, mothers shielded children from stray bullets and men checked corners for armed retreating soldiers. The logistical challenges of stabilizing these regions were immense. Allied commanders worked tirelessly to establish temporary checkpoints, distribute rations, and maintain order in towns destabilized by sudden power vacuums. Units were tasked with disarming remaining German soldiers, many of whom had been cut off from supply lines and orders for weeks. In Denmark, German forces officially surrendered on May 5, 1945, yet sporadic pockets continued to resist compliance, requiring Allied patrols to maintain a cautious presence. Similarly, along the Norwegian coast, German coastal units formally capitulated only on May 8, 1945, demonstrating that even as V-Day celebrations dominated headlines, the war's practical conclusion remained uneven across different regions. Soldiers tasked with these operations navigated flooded fields, snowmelt mud, and collapsing infrastructure, their physical exhaustion compounded by the psychological weight of knowing the war's official end did not immediately translate into security. In southern Germany, Allied intelligence officers moved among the chaos, tracking unaccounted units and attempting to map out surrender locations, supply stockpiles, and potential threats. Debris from destroyed bridges and railways slowed movement, while abandoned equipment, tanks, rifles, and trucks, offered both an opportunity and a hazard. Civilians emerged from shelters to scavenge, often risking encounters with remaining armed personnel. Every encounter was measured, every movement calculated. Commanders kept meticulous records, aware that small mistakes could result in unnecessary casualties or political complications during the delicate process of occupation. Soldiers experienced moments of tension punctuated by silence, their senses sharpened by months of combat that could not simply be turned off with the stroke of a pen. The emotional layer of this period was equally complex. Soldiers, while eager to return to families and communities, often felt displaced themselves, caught between celebration and the realities of residual operations. Letters and dispatches described men walking through villages with faces unreadable, observing civilians celebrating while their own minds replayed recent skirmishes, last-minute orders, and the deaths of comrades. In towns along the Danube, Allied patrols found young German recruits, barely trained, surrendering under heavy supervision, their fear palpable. These encounters were silent reminders that V-Day, though celebrated with grand speeches and parades, represented an administrative and symbolic conclusion more than an immediate shift in the lived experience of those on the ground. The environmental conditions added another layer of challenge. Flooded fields, spring rains, and muddy roads slowed movements, while the detritus of months of conflict, burned out vehicles, collapsed buildings, and scattered personal belongings, transformed landscapes into gauntlets for patrols and civilians alike. Soldiers had to navigate not just potential combat, but also the hazards of destroyed infrastructure, exposed barbed wire, and the remnants of air raids. Every step carried weight, both literal and metaphorical, a reminder that the end of hostilities did not erase the hazards imposed by 6 years of unrelenting conflict. As the week progressed, the contrast between public celebration and operational reality became more pronounced. While radios in London broadcast V-Day festivities and newsreels showcased cheering crowds in Paris and other liberated cities, soldiers in isolated regions of southern Germany, Denmark, Norway, and Czechoslovakia remained vigilant. The war was technically over, yet the work of enforcing surrender, securing civilians, distributing supplies, and accounting for the last remaining forces extended well beyond the proclamations of peace. These efforts underscored the paradox of victory, a continent publicly rejoicing, yet militarily still embroiled in micro-battles, logistical struggles, and the psychological burden of sustained conflict. By the end of the first week following V-Day, the layered complexity of the immediate post-surrender period became apparent. Soldiers reported back to headquarters, civilian administrators attempted to restore order, and displaced persons began moving toward towns and cities that were now technically liberated but physically scarred. Communications improved gradually, though many units remained isolated or out of range, relying on messengers and sporadic radio updates. The juxtaposition of jubilant press coverage and on-the-ground challenges provided a stark reminder that the official surrender of Germany on May 7, 1945 in Reims, followed by ratification in Berlin, marked not a seamless transition to peace, but the beginning of a delicate process of stabilization, reintegration, and recovery. Soldiers, civilians, and commanders alike navigated this uncertain landscape, their experiences capturing the human, operational, and logistical complexity of a war that, though formally ended, continued to reverberate through every street, village, and battlefield across Europe. The days leading into and immediately following May 8, 1945 revealed a world beyond the parades and celebrations, a landscape where victory existed alongside unimaginable suffering. As Allied forces pressed into central Germany and Austria in April and early May, they encountered the physical remnants of a regime that had industrialized cruelty with chilling efficiency. Camps such as Buchenwald, liberated on April 11, 1945, Dachau, on April 29, 1945, and Mauthausen, on May 5, 1945, unveiled horrors that civilians and soldiers alike struggled to comprehend. Approaching these sites, troops were first met by the silence of abandoned perimeters, the barbed wire glinting faintly under a pale spring sun, fences twisted from years of neglect and intermittent shelling. Smoke from small fires lingered in the morning air, mixed with the unmistakable, acrid stench of decay. Bodies lay in makeshift piles or scattered across courtyards, some partially covered, others exposed, the victims' features frozen in expressions of exhaustion, terror, or disbelief. In Buchenwald, soldiers advancing through the camp's gates were confronted by survivors too weak to stand, clinging to the walls, trembling with a mixture of hope and incredulity. The weight of months, even years, of forced labor, starvation, and abuse was etched into every movement, every gesture. Soldiers moved cautiously, aware that the scene before them required both compassion and a disciplined presence, documenting the evidence, assisting the living, and navigating the psychological burden of witnessing atrocity. The survivors whispered names of friends and relatives who had vanished, recounting moments of terror, executions, and the mechanical cruelty of a system designed to erase humanity. Many had lost family members entirely. Others had endured unimaginable trials that left their bodies fragile and their minds wary of trust. The shock of encountering such concentrated suffering created a quiet tension among the liberating troops, a mixture of empathy, grief, and the hollow realization that their mission had expanded beyond combat to include the moral responsibility of bearing witness. At Dachau, liberated on April 29, 1945, the scene was equally harrowing. Soldiers encountered barracks emptied of occupants yet filled with the remnants of human life, discarded clothing, tattered mattresses, overturned stoves, and scattered personal effects. In the yard, rows of skeletal figures moved with a tentative energy, guided by soldiers distributing food and water. The cries of survivors pierced the air, alternating between relief, hysteria, and grief, creating a soundtrack of human suffering layered over the distant hum of ongoing operations outside the camp. Trucks arrived carrying medical personnel, supplies, and journalists, their presence a further reminder that the atrocities of the camps were no longer hidden from the world. Soldiers and medics worked tirelessly, administering care where possible, but the scale of need often overwhelmed their ability to act, highlighting the immense human cost that victory could not erase. Mauthausen, liberated on May 5, 1945, revealed yet another dimension of the Nazi system of oppression. Situated in a rugged Austrian landscape, the camp's granite quarries had served as sites of forced labor where prisoners were worked to exhaustion under brutal conditions. Bodies were discovered in the quarries and along narrow paths, many too weak to survive the relentless demands imposed by guards. The physical environment itself, a steep, rocky terrain, amplified the survivors' trauma, each step forward a reminder of the cruelty that had been imposed upon them. Soldiers moving through the camp carried stretchers, distributed blankets, and offered words of comfort, their own emotions tempered by professional discipline and the overwhelming scale of suffering. The realization that liberation had come only in the final days of the European conflict left many reflecting on the narrow margins between survival and death. The juxtaposition of jubilation elsewhere and horror within these camps created a surreal, almost unbearable contrast. While radios broadcast V-Day celebrations, the clatter of parades, and public addresses praising the courage of Allied troops, the soldiers and civilians navigating liberated camps experienced a different reality. The human cost of victory became palpable in each hollow-eyed survivor, each pile of abandoned possessions, each hastily documented record of mass killings. Emotional layering deepened as soldiers grappled with conflicting impulses, relief that the fighting had ended, horror at what they now saw, and guilt that survival had spared them from the fates that so many others endured. Families reunited in Western Europe were experiencing joy, while across Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, the immediacy of human suffering demanded attention, care, and the sober recording of events. Medical teams worked alongside soldiers to stabilize survivors, improvising treatment in makeshift infirmaries or repurposed barracks. Food, water, and medicine were distributed cautiously, as many prisoners' weakened bodies could not handle sudden nourishment. Soldiers noted the psychological trauma etched into every gesture, hands trembling while reaching for bread, eyes darting nervously at movements, survivors staring blankly as if trying to reconcile years of horror with a sudden, fragile liberation. Occasionally, individuals would collapse into tears, some wailing aloud, others silent, the sound echoing off barracks walls like an audible imprint of human suffering. Commanders recorded the conditions meticulously, aware that photographic evidence, medical logs, and personal testimonies would be necessary for both historical documentation and impending war crimes tribunals. The liberation also revealed the industrialized nature of atrocities. Documents, lists of prisoners, ration logs, and medical experiments outlined systematic cruelty. Soldiers processed the contrast. A war officially ending on May 8, 1945, a Europe celebrating peace, while the remnants of Nazi policy lay starkly exposed in every corner. Environmental cues reinforced the reality: smoke from small fires, the metallic tang of blood in the air, shattered windows, and the decaying scent of neglected latrines formed a sensory backdrop to the moral reckoning faced by soldiers and medics. The quiet moments of reflection, such as handing a blanket to a survivor or observing the sun illuminate the twisted barbed wire, were punctuated by the relentless need to act, to organize, and to document, blending operational necessity with emotional burden. Even in moments of tentative hope, challenges persisted. Displaced survivors required relocation, medical attention, and communication with families, all while Allied troops managed logistics across fractured landscapes. Transportation infrastructure remained crippled, rail lines were destroyed, roads scarred by retreating armies, and towns still partially occupied by remaining German units or looters. The liberating forces moved cautiously, balancing the need for order with the moral imperative to provide immediate relief. Each decision carried weight, affecting thousands of lives in real time. By the time the first V-Day celebrations reached the camp populations in early May, soldiers and civilians alike began to process the enormity of what they had witnessed. The liberation of Buchenwald, Dachau, Mauthausen, and other camps revealed that while the European theater of World War II had officially ended, the war's human consequences remained profoundly present. Survivors began tentative steps toward recovery, soldiers documented events with meticulous care, and medics stabilized the most critical cases, laying the groundwork for what would become a prolonged period of rehabilitation, remembrance, and justice. The stark contrast between celebration and suffering, between victory and lingering horror, encapsulated the complex emotional landscape of Europe on May 8, 1945 and in the days immediately following. The world rejoiced, yet the liberated camps stood as a sobering testament to the human cost of conflict, a moral imperative that would echo across decades of historical memory, legal reckoning, and collective reflection. By early May 1945, as the euphoria of May 8 V-Day spread across Western Europe, the continent faced a fragile and uneven peace. Cities celebrated, parades marched, and radios broadcast speeches, yet beneath the surface, chaos persisted in towns and regions recently liberated or still in transition. The surrender of Germany on May 7, 1945, ratified in Berlin shortly thereafter, marked the formal end of hostilities, but the daily reality for civilians, soldiers, and administrators remained complex and disordered. Roads were still clogged with refugees fleeing destroyed towns partially occupied by remaining German units, and the rubble left from relentless Allied advances, particularly in southern Germany and Austria. Allied forces, tasked with enforcing surrender and establishing order, moved cautiously through this fractured landscape, aware that pockets of resistance, looting, and unregulated movement could erupt into renewed violence at any moment. In cities like Vienna and Linz, the collapse of German administrative structures created immediate challenges. Local governments had either fled or been dismantled, leaving a vacuum that Allied officers attempted to fill. Soldiers were often the first to arrive, distributing rations, coordinating medical care, and establishing temporary checkpoints to prevent disorder from escalating. The streets were filled with displaced persons, their faces etched with fatigue, confusion, and relief at surviving years of occupation and aerial bombardment. Families moved tentatively through the debris, carrying possessions salvaged from partially destroyed homes, while children clung to parents or siblings, struggling to comprehend the sudden shift from wartime fear to cautious liberty. Allied troops, themselves exhausted from weeks of final offensives, understood that maintaining order required patience, discretion, and careful assessment of both human behavior and terrain. The physical environment contributed to the sense of instability. Cities such as Dresden, bombed in February 1945, and Hamburg, devastated by summer 1943 raids, remained in ruins. Streets were scarred with craters, partially collapsed buildings formed perilous passages, and bridges destroyed in the retreat of German forces obstructed movement. Temporary shelters had sprung up wherever possible, often overcrowded and unsanitary, making the spread of disease a constant concern. Soldiers, administrators, and medics coordinated efforts to provide water, food, and medical assistance, yet logistical challenges limited their effectiveness. The sheer scale of destruction underscored that peace, though officially declared, was a fragile construct resting on the careful orchestration of forces struggling to restore normality. Displaced persons were among the most vulnerable. Millions of civilians, Jews, forced laborers, political prisoners, and ordinary Germans fleeing the advancing Allies, moved across borders, seeking safety, food, and shelter. The routes were treacherous. Flooded fields, mined roads, and railway lines disrupted by retreating armies created hazards for those traveling on foot, by cart, or in overcrowded trains. Refugee columns stretched for miles, their progress slow and exhausting, while soldiers patrolled alongside to prevent chaos or attacks from remaining armed groups. Some civilians carried newborns or injured relatives, others dragged bundles of meager belongings, the remnants of lives uprooted by war. Each step forward carried both hope and risk, as the formal end of hostilities had not yet reached the farthest corners of Central Europe. In towns liberated in early May, such as Prague during the uprising from 5 to 8 May 1945, civilians encountered not just German soldiers surrendering but also armed locals, spontaneous militias, and scavengers. While Allied units sought to maintain order, the overlap of multiple groups created tension. Soldiers had to make rapid decisions about disarmament, distribution of resources, and the handling of prisoners, balancing humanitarian needs with military prudence. In southern Germany, units moving through Bavaria and Saxony faced similar challenges. Local populations wary of occupation, retreating German soldiers seeking to evade capture, and the logistical nightmare of transporting supplies through damaged infrastructure. Each town presented unique conditions, requiring adaptability and careful judgment from officers and troops alike. The political dimension added further complexity. Allied commands had to negotiate the immediate establishment of occupation zones, delineating responsibility between British, American, and Soviet forces. These zones dictated not only military presence but also administrative authority, impacting civilians' access to resources, safety, and governance. In Austria, for instance, Allied patrols arrived to find local governments in disarray, resistance groups asserting authority in certain districts, and German collaborators attempting to obscure evidence of wartime crimes. Soldiers and officers navigated this shifting political terrain cautiously, aware that missteps could exacerbate tensions or spark conflicts in regions already destabilized by years of occupation and battle. Amid this operational and political chaos, the psychological weight on both soldiers and civilians was profound. Soldiers were exhausted, their experiences over the past weeks, particularly the intense urban combat in Berlin culminating on May 2, 1945, still vivid in memory. Their fatigue was compounded by the need to exercise restraint and empathy as they enforced order among civilians whose lives had been upended by the war. Many had witnessed atrocities or endured months of relentless pressure, and yet they were now expected to provide guidance, protection, and coordination in a context that lacked clear structure. Civilians, in turn, experienced conflicting emotions, relief that hostilities were formally over, lingering fear from months of oppression or bombing, and uncertainty about the future in regions where government and law enforcement structures had collapsed. the logistical efforts to stabilize these regions were enormous. Allied units organized displaced persons camps, ration distribution centers, and medical outposts, attempting to mitigate the suffering caused by food shortages, injuries, and disease. Soldiers and administrators worked together to restore basic utilities where possible, repair roads, and reopen limited public services. Even as celebratory announcements continued in Western Europe, the daily reality on the ground remained one of painstaking recovery, requiring patience, coordination, and adaptability. The juxtaposition of jubilant parades in London and Paris with these labor-intensive stabilization efforts reinforced the uneven and fragile nature of peace across the continent. By mid-May, as displaced persons began to be relocated, former German soldiers formally surrendered in isolated pockets, including units in Denmark on May 5, 1945 and Norwegian coastal positions on May 8, 1945, gradually easing the immediate threat of lingering combat. Yet the combination of ruined infrastructure, displaced populations, and fragile governance meant that order remained provisional. Soldiers continued to patrol streets, mediate disputes, and oversee distribution efforts, often walking among civilians whose survival depended on their presence. The psychological landscape mirrored the physical one, relief interwoven with exhaustion, hope tempered by trauma, and a cautious awareness that the continent's recovery would take years rather than weeks. Even in the midst of these challenges, moments of humanity emerged. Soldiers assisted families in rebuilding homes, helped children recover stolen possessions, and facilitated reunions between separated relatives. Civilians worked alongside occupying forces to clear streets, repair water lines, and reopen schools. These acts, though small against the vast backdrop of destruction, created the first tangible steps toward reconstruction and the restoration of normal life. The contrast between these gestures of hope and the pervasive presence of devastation underscored the paradox of post-war Europe, a continent simultaneously celebrating peace and confronting the tangible legacies of 6 years of total war. By the end of the first weeks after V-Day, the contours of Europe's fragile order had begun to emerge. Soldiers and civilians, though exhausted, had taken initial steps toward stabilization, yet the lingering presence of displaced populations, damaged infrastructure, and remaining German garrisons highlighted that the formal surrender of May 7, 1945 represented a beginning rather than an end. Victory had been declared, but Europe remained a continent in transition, its recovery dependent on careful administration, sustained effort, and the human capacity to rebuild amid the ruins of conflict. The juxtaposition of jubilation and labor, celebration and caution, illuminated the complex reality of peace in May 1945, a fragile equilibrium where hope coexisted with the pressing demands of recovery, setting the stage for the continent's long and difficult path toward reconstruction. Even after the formal declaration of victory on May 8, 1945, the European landscape remained far from settled. While crowds celebrated in capitals and liberated cities, Allied intelligence and field reports painted a more complicated picture. Pockets of German soldiers had yet to formally surrender, particularly in remote or isolated locations across Denmark, Norway, Austria, and southern Germany. In Denmark, German units officially capitulated on May 5, 1945, but sporadic compliance meant that patrols continued to encounter armed individuals attempting to retreat or hide weapons. Similarly, along the Norwegian coast, surrender was confirmed on May 8, 1945, yet isolated outposts retained operational capacity, requiring Allied oversight. Soldiers moving through these regions remained vigilant, aware that even small miscalculations could result in accidental clashes, injuries, or renewed hostilities. The reality of V-Day as a singular point of victory was therefore complicated by the ongoing management of unaccounted forces and delayed compliance, a subtle reminder that the end of war was as much a logistical and operational challenge as a symbolic moment. In southern Germany, units of the Wehrmacht had retreated into forests, small towns, and rural regions, avoiding surrender until Allied forces could secure their positions. Patrols moving through Bavaria and Saxony encountered abandoned weapons, sabotaged vehicles, and towns partially destroyed by defensive operations. Soldiers navigating these zones reported eerie silences punctuated by occasional gunfire, evidence that the final days of fighting, while officially over, had left traces of tension in the landscape. Fields still bore the marks of armored vehicle movement, trenches, and hastily dug defensive positions. Bridges destroyed in retreat created bottlenecks, forcing patrols and civilians alike to navigate muddy riverbanks or precarious makeshift crossings. Each step was measured, every movement calculated, as soldiers balanced the need for security with humanitarian obligations toward civilians who had survived occupation and the final offensives. Intelligence units worked tirelessly to map out these remaining forces, identifying areas where German troops were still holding positions or delaying surrender. In Bavaria, reconnaissance noted units in the vicinity of Garmisch-Partenkirchen and along the Austrian border that had been cut off from Central Command during the Allied advance into southern Germany following the fall of Berlin on May 2, 1945. These units often consisted of exhausted, disorganized soldiers, many of whom were aware that the larger war was lost but uncertain how to formally capitulate. Orders were communicated through a patchwork of radio messages, courier dispatches, and local intermediaries, with delays sometimes stretching for days. Soldiers on the ground adapted to these circumstances, maintaining disciplined patrols, monitoring for hidden stockpiles of weapons, and overseeing the surrender process in coordination with regional commanders. The presence of hidden threats extended beyond armed resistance. Stockpiles of munitions, unexploded ordnance, and partially destroyed infrastructure created hazards for both civilians and soldiers. Towns still littered with mines or sabotaged equipment required careful navigation, particularly in areas like Salzburg and Innsbruck, where retreating German engineers had attempted to destroy key transportation routes. Field units often encountered abandoned vehicles containing explosive devices, and patrols had to train their attention not only on potential human threats, but on the deadly remnants of a war fought with total commitment to destruction. These operational challenges reinforced the understanding that V-Day did not automatically translate into safety. The war's technical conclusion left a residual landscape of danger requiring disciplined management. Across Central Europe, displaced civilians continued to move, seeking safer towns or attempting to return to homes damaged or destroyed by combat. Columns of refugees moved along damaged railways or roads filled with rubble, often encountering Allied patrols that offered guidance, protection, and occasionally limited rations. Soldiers observed both resilience and desperation in these populations, children clinging to parents, elders carrying meager belongings, and groups of families navigating difficult terrain after years of wartime deprivation. The interaction between remaining German soldiers, Allied troops, and civilians created a complex dynamic, where small decisions could have significant consequences for safety, morale, and trust. Even as operational tasks dominated, the psychological dimension remained central. Soldiers were exhausted by months of intense combat culminating in the fall of Berlin and the final offensives into southern Germany and Austria. They had witnessed atrocities in liberated camps, endured the death of comrades, and navigated relentless combat, only to find themselves now tasked with policing the formal surrender and ensuring compliance among remnants of enemy forces. Their vigilance was matched by civilians' cautious optimism. Families tentatively ventured into towns, attempting to resume daily life while remaining aware of lingering risks. The juxtaposition of relief, fear, and uncertainty created a palpable tension that defined the immediate post-surrender period. In addition to isolated units, intelligence officers monitored the potential for hidden Nazi networks, stockpiled weapons, and unreported atrocities. Reports surfaced of German soldiers attempting to bury evidence of crimes or move assets to remote locations, underscoring that victory on paper did not immediately remove threats to civilians or Allied personnel. In towns across Bavaria, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, units were tasked with clearing remaining fortifications, identifying and disarming caches of munitions, and documenting conditions for post-war tribunals. Each task was executed with deliberate care, emphasizing the operational, moral, and historical responsibility placed upon troops in the days following formal surrender. The slow process of formalizing surrender in isolated regions extended into late May. Communications improved gradually, but soldiers continued to verify compliance, often escorting groups of German soldiers to headquarters for registration and disarmament. The act of surrender became a controlled process rather than a spontaneous one, ensuring that potential threats were neutralized, civilians protected, and documentation prepared for historical record. While celebrations in capitals had long faded, the work of enforcing peace continued in towns, forests, and mountains, a reminder that the tangible end of conflict lagged behind the symbolic moment of V-Day. This period also emphasized the complexity of human behavior in war's final days. Some German units surrendered willingly, exhausted and demoralized, while others delayed or resisted quietly, fearful of reprisals or hoping to negotiate better terms. Civilians, too, displayed a spectrum of responses: relief at liberation, caution born of years under occupation, and wariness toward both Allied forces and neighbors with complicated wartime histories. Soldiers navigated these dynamics with measured attention, balancing authority with compassion, and recognizing that the management of hidden threats required both discipline and empathy. By late May 1945, the picture had become clearer. Pockets of resistance were contained, delayed surrenders processed, and civilians tentatively resuming daily life. Roads were gradually reopened, supply lines restored, and temporary governance structures established under Allied oversight. The operational landscape, though still fragile, had begun to stabilize, illustrating that V-Day marked not a singular moment of triumph but a protracted process of verification, enforcement, and adaptation. Soldiers and administrators alike reflected on the paradox. While the war had ended officially, the vigilance required to secure lasting peace remained as critical as any engagement fought during the preceding 6 years. The hidden threats of late May 1945 revealed that peace, particularly in a continent scarred by years of total war, could not be assumed. Disarmed soldiers, cleared stockpiles, and stabilizing populations were the tangible indicators that the European theater had shifted from active conflict to controlled transition. Yet each patrol, each convoy, and each administrative effort underscored the complexity of turning official surrender into lived security. Victory on paper required a disciplined process to be realized in practice, a truth that Allied forces navigated carefully amid the ruins, displaced populations, and lingering presence of armed elements. In this way, the weeks following V-Day were not merely a celebration of triumph but a delicate orchestration of order, reflecting the intricate and enduring consequences of a conflict that had reshaped the continent entirely. By late May 1945, the streets of Europe had begun to settle into an uneasy rhythm. The initial euphoria of May 8 V-Day had faded into a quieter, more contemplative atmosphere, as soldiers, civilians, and administrators alike began to confront the magnitude of what the war had left behind. Across Germany, Austria, and parts of Czechoslovakia, cities were scarred by months, or in some cases, years, of relentless conflict. Dresden and Hamburg bore the physical imprint of aerial bombardment, their streets littered with rubble, fractured masonry, and the occasional skeletal frame of a building that had once stood proudly in the pre-war skyline. In towns like Linz and Salzburg, structures that had survived the fighting were hollowed by sabotage, and bridges destroyed in retreat forced weary civilians and Allied units to navigate rivers and streams through improvised crossings. The continent was officially at peace, yet in the lived reality, the work of rebuilding, of healing, and of remembering had only just begun. Soldiers assigned to occupation and stabilization duties were a constant presence in these fragile communities. Patrols moved along streets still marked by shell craters, rubble, and the debris of war, ensuring that looted areas were secured, abandoned weapons accounted for, and civilians guided towards safe housing and basic resources. Many units had been redeployed from the front lines of Berlin, Bavaria, and Austria, arriving with exhaustion evident in every movement, uniforms soiled with weeks of travel, boots worn down to the soles, and eyes still shadowed by the horrors of combat and liberation missions. They carried the dual responsibility of ensuring security while offering assistance, aware that their actions would set the tone for recovery, reconciliation, and the fragile reconstruction of civil life. Civilians moved cautiously through this post-war landscape, some returning to homes partially destroyed, others seeking family members who had been displaced for months or even years. Refugee columns that had begun forming in early May persisted, though their destinations were gradually clarified by Allied administrators establishing temporary camps and providing guidance on safe routes. Families traveled with possessions carried by hand cart, or the occasional horse-drawn vehicle, the scale of movement immense yet meticulous. Children clung to parents, some bewildered by the sudden shift from fear and deprivation to tentative freedom, their faces reflecting both relief and confusion. Elderly civilians, often the most vulnerable, struggled to manage the physical and emotional strain, requiring constant assistance from soldiers and aid workers. The human effort to rebuild daily life moved forward slowly, deliberately, a reflection of both the trauma endured and the practical obstacles remaining in towns, railways, and rural roads alike. One of the most pressing challenges was the psychological weight carried by both soldiers and civilians. Soldiers who had been part of final operations in Berlin, Prague, and southern Germany were forced to confront the lingering impact of 6 years of total war. They had witnessed combat, atrocities, and death on a scale that few could articulate, and the post-war period provided little reprieve from these experiences. Similarly, civilians who had endured occupation, bombings, and the forced labor of family members faced the stark reality that liberation did not erase memory. Survivors of concentration camps, relocated prisoners, and displaced families required immediate care, both physical and emotional. Soldiers and medics provided blankets, food, and guidance, But the deep psychological scars of war remained evident in every expression, every gesture, and every quiet moment of reflection. Reconstruction of infrastructure became a daily priority. Railways that had been bombed or sabotaged were repaired in makeshift stages, facilitating the movement of food, medicine, and displaced populations. Roads, often cratered and obstructed, were cleared slowly by combined civilian and military efforts. Bridges were reconstructed or temporarily replaced to allow essential transport, while electrical lines, water supplies, and communications networks were restored gradually. The physical labor of recovery mirrored the emotional labor required. Rebuilding lives and cities simultaneously demanded discipline, coordination, and the patience to reconcile the immediate necessities with long-term planning. Allied administrators faced a delicate balancing act. Occupation zones established in May 1945 required careful coordination between British, American, and Soviet forces. Decisions about governance, resource allocation, and civil order had to consider both military necessity and humanitarian need. In Austria, temporary civil administrations were formed, attempting to re-establish order in towns like Linz, Salzburg, and Innsbruck, where local authority had collapsed. Soldiers served as both enforcers and facilitators, mediating disputes, distributing essential goods, and guiding civilians through a period of uncertainty. The process of rebuilding social structures was painstaking and fraught with potential for tension, yet it was essential for creating a foundation for lasting peace. Amid these logistical and administrative challenges, moments of human connection and reflection emerged. Families reunited after months of separation, children laughed tentatively in the streets, and neighbors worked together to clear debris or repair homes. Soldiers who had once been engaged in relentless combat found themselves assisting in acts of community restoration, carrying water, delivering supplies, or simply offering reassurance to those still traumatized by the recent past. These acts, small yet significant, highlighted the enduring human capacity for resilience, compassion, and recovery even in the shadow of immense destruction. The moral dimension of reconstruction remained omnipresent. Allied forces documented atrocities, collected evidence, and began preparations for war crimes tribunals, ensuring that the human suffering of the preceding 6 years would not be forgotten. Survivors of camps like Dachau, Buchenwald, and Mauthausen were given support to begin the slow process of recovery, their testimonies forming the foundation of historical memory and justice. Soldiers, medics, and administrators bore witness to the scale of devastation while working to restore dignity, order, and hope, recognizing that the end of combat marked only the first step in a broader struggle to rebuild lives and communities. By the end of May 1945, Europe was simultaneously a continent in recovery and a landscape of unresolved trauma. Cities still bore the scars of conflict, displaced populations continued their journeys, and soldiers and administrators worked tirelessly to stabilize regions. Yet amid the destruction, the first tentative signs of life and normality emerged. Children played cautiously in open streets, markets reopened with limited goods, and survivors began communicating with relatives from whom they had been separated. The juxtaposition of lingering devastation with these small signs of hope illustrated the duality of post-war Europe, a continent at peace on paper, yet grappling with the tangible consequences of 6 years of total war. Ultimately, the surrender of Germany and the celebrations of V-Day represented a symbolic triumph. But the human and operational realities that followed underscored the complexity of peace. Soldiers, civilians, and administrators navigated a landscape of destroyed infrastructure, displaced populations, lingering threats, and profound psychological trauma. Yet through coordinated effort, compassion, and the human instinct to rebuild, Europe began to take its first steps toward recovery. The quiet moments of reflection, the acts of rebuilding, and the tentative re-establishment of order marked the beginning of a new chapter in history, one defined not by the roar of artillery or the clamor of victory parades, but by the enduring resilience of human beings determined to reclaim their lives from the shadow of war. History remembers the battles, but the untold stories live here. Subscribe to WW2 Impact and join us as we uncover the hidden moments, forgotten heroes, and shocking secrets of World War II. Don't just watch history, experience it. Hit the bell so you never miss the stories they tried to erase.